Welcome to Standard Deviants School, American Government. I'm Christiana Knight. Today's program, Introduction to Government. We'll teach you about the thing that keeps the United States running, and we'll have a good time doing it.
Here's what we'll cover. First, we'll look at where the ideas for American government came from. Next, we'll go over the 6 main characteristics of a democracy. Then we'll tell you all about the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. And finally, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and wrap up with the Constitutional Convention. Ready? Set? Let's begin.
I'm here in Washington, D.C. on the steps of this nation's Capitol building, the welcome mat of American government. That's right, all that legal and democratic magic that you read about in the papers or watch on public affairs channels like C-SPAN, most of it happens right here.
But that doesn't mean it all started here. Before a government can become mighty enough to deserve its own cable channel, it needs some founding principles. And we'd like to help demystify the origin and nature of American government. And what better place to start than at its humble origin?
Way, way, way back, the ancient Greeks had a lot of time on their hands. When they weren't thinking of sneaky ways to fool the Trojans or inventing science, they busied themselves by tossing around some pretty neat ideas about governments. You may have heard of a guy named Aristotle. He was alive around 350 BC. Aristotle came up with a groovy idea called natural law. Aristotle's theory of natural law holds that society should be governed by certain ethical principles.
When we say ethical principles, we're talking about all the things you should or shouldn't do in society. Aristotle figured that it really wasn't right for a government to disrespect its citizens.
So, based on Aristotle's ethical principles, it wasn't right for a government to come in and take over a citizen's land or steal his leaning posts.
Aristotle's concept that governments should respect individual citizens was rather groundbreaking. But it was unfortunate for the citizens that Aristotle's principles didn't top the charts until centuries after their rockin' debut. After the Greeks and Aristotle, things were stagnant in government development for hundreds of years.
But then the 18th century rolled around and things really started hopping. A bunch of Europeans started making waves with some new revolutionary ideas. We call this period in history the Age of Enlightenment. It took place during the 16 and 1700s.
Stop and listen!
During the Age of Enlightenment, philosophers and a handful of other smart folks went around encouraging people to seek alternatives to oppressive governments, those governments that interfered with the personal rights of its citizens. Bad government, bad.
In response, heavy thinkers began to argue a new idea called popular consent. Popular consent asserts that people should be able to participate directly in the governing of their own societies.
One of those heavy thinkers we mentioned was John Locke. Locke took the idea of popular consent a step further and developed it into what is known as the social contract theory. The social contract theory compares the relationship between a society and its citizens to parties entering into a contract.
Basically, Locke argued that all individuals are naturally free. Therefore, people give their consent when they become members of a society. And if a society's government breaks this contract by acting improperly, then the people have the right to revolt. In fact, Locke said that not only do citizens have a right to revolt, they also have a duty to revolt. Pretty radical, huh?
And if a population rebels and breaks its contract with an ill-behaved government, they have the right to start a new, kinder, gentler government. And that's pretty much what happened here in America.
But first, the Founding Fathers still had some pretty tough decisions to make. The founders knew that a new government was needed, but what type should they choose? Well, let's find out about some of their options.
After the Revolutionary War and before this great big building was built, the Founding Fathers all got together to discuss what type of government to establish. They considered 4 types altogether: the monarchy, the oligarchy, the aristocracy, and the democracy. Now, you probably already know which one they picked, but it's also important to know which ones they didn't.
A monarchy is a form of government in which hereditary rulers, that's people who share the same bloodline, better known as kings and queens, wield absolute power over everybody. If a king or a queen has absolute power, it means they can do pretty much whatever they want.
All the land to the west of the hills shall be yours.
But darling, I plan to use all the land to the west for my cricket matches.
Oh. Off with his head!
Since the founders knew that monarchy didn't really fly in the American colonies, what with the King of England being an old wet blanket, other forms of government were carefully considered.
There was the oligarchy. An oligarchy is made up of a body of individuals possessing high levels of wealth, social or military status, or achievement. And there was aristocracy. Aristocracy is ruled by a privileged few.
Now, as nice as monarchies, oligarchies, and aristocracies sound, part of the whole reason the descendants of the Founding Fathers left Europe in the first place was to avoid government structures that left little or no popular consent to the people. So they decided to set up a fourth type of government known as democracy.
A democracy is a form of government in which people hold the power to rule themselves. There are two main types of democracy. There's direct democracy and indirect democracy.
In a direct democracy, the people all get together and have an equal say in the laws they create. So, in a direct democracy, majority rules, kind of like when people get together to have a town meeting and vote on whether to build a playground or a nuclear power plant.
In an indirect democracy, which is also known as representative democracy, people vote for representatives who work on their behalf to create laws. In an indirect democracy, each citizen gets one vote. Once chosen, these representatives then vote within a government structure in order to make and pass laws. This is a two-step version of democracy.
The Founding Fathers of our country decided to go with an indirect democracy. After all, they figured that at some point in time, America would become a really, really big nation. And if that happened, there'd be no way they could possibly get everyone together in order to facilitate direct rule.
So, indirect democracy it is. But there's a little more to it than just making that decision. The Founding Fathers also had to decide what they wanted in a democracy. Let's take a look at the results.
A key idea in American democracy is balance. The delicate balance between many opposing ideas is a theme you'll run into throughout your study of American government.
How did the Founding Fathers achieve that balance, and on their first government, no less? Hi, I'm Jim Lauper, attorney at Democratic Law. Well, there are 6 key components to American democracy, and they're all closely tied to the social contract theory and natural law that we discussed earlier.
The 6 main components of American democracy are popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty. We'll look at each in turn.
Popular consent is the belief that a government exists only with the consent of the governed, that is, the people. It's a big part of the social contract theory we discussed earlier. With popular consent, government leaders do not get the right to govern from God, from their economic standing, or from their family lineage. They get the right to govern from their governed, the people.
Popular sovereignty is the right a society has to govern itself. Now, in a representative democracy, the people delegate day-to-day governing powers to a body of elected representatives. The concept of popular sovereignty is a lot like the next component, majority rule. Majority rule maintains that only the policies supported by a majority of voters shall become law.
Next, individualism maintains that citizens have certain rights that a government isn't allowed to take away. They're called inalienable rights, and they include things like life, liberty, and property. For instance, in America, you have the right to practice whatever religion you believe in. The government didn't give you that right. You were born with it, if you were born in the U.S. of A. In America, it's the government's responsibility to protect that right, and they cannot take it away.
Next, equality holds that all members of a democracy wield equal power.
All qualified citizens get one vote, and one vote only, in American elections.
And finally, personal liberty deals with certain personal rights and freedoms that the government cannot interfere with.
In America, the government shouldn't tell you where you should live or with whom you should live. That's your own business, and that's personal liberty.
So those are the 6 main components of American democracy: popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty. Know them, love them, say them in your sleep.
The ideas for American government came from the political philosophers Aristotle and John Locke. Aristotle's natural law concept states that a society should be governed by certain ethical principles and that a government should respect the rights of its citizens. John Locke expanded this into the social contract theory. This theory compares the relationship between the government and its citizens to parties entering into a contract.
With those concepts in hand, the Founding Fathers considered 4 different types of governments: monarchy, oligarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. There are two types of democracy: direct, in which the people make the laws themselves, and indirect, in which the people choose representatives to work on their behalf.
The 6 main characteristics of a democracy are popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty.
The ideas that serve as a cornerstone of the U.S. Constitution were around long before the Constitution was ever written. You see, early settlers from Europe brought with them some of the political ideas that were later incorporated into the framework for a new government. Now we'll take you way, way back to some important stuff that happened before the Constitution was written.
Permanent English settlers first came to America in the early 17th century, 1607 to be exact, in Jamestown, Virginia.
Settlers came to America for a lot of different reasons. Some came to flee religious persecution. Some came because there was an abundance of land to be had. And still others came to enjoy the convenience of 24-hour banking. Whatever the reason, America eventually became the most popular hangout in the world. And soon it was clear that a new nation was born.
The relationship between the American colonies and the English crown between the 1620s and mid-1700s played a big part in the birth of the American government. Those early years would greatly affect the decisions the Founding Fathers would eventually make regarding the structure of the American government.
After all those folks came over to what was then the New World, the colonies of settlers and the Crown formed a basic agreement. The Crown determined that it was allowed to regulate trade and conduct international affairs, and the colonies were given the right to govern many of their own domestic affairs, including the power to levy their own taxes. The colonies even got to use the family car, but only on the weekends.
The relationship between the Crown and the colonies worked pretty well until the 1760s.
By that time, England had just sunk a whole lot of money into the French and Indian War as they tried to keep their hold over the New World. When the war ended in 1760 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, England was left monetarily drained. England turned to the colonies to try and recoup some of its losses and raise money by tightening its hold on the colonies. After all, the money had been spent on the protection of the colonies. England first restricted the westward expansion of the colonies and then passed 3 tough laws, which back then were called acts: the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and the Quartering Act of 1765. Here's a look at each act.
The Sugar Act of 1764 placed taxes on sugar, coffee, and other products that were exported to the colonies. This raised the prices of goods that colonists got from England.
The Stamp Act required all colonists to purchase things called stamps for all documents, including mail, contracts, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards.
And the Quartering Act of 1765 required colonists to house British soldiers in their own homes.
The Stamp Act Congress, held in 1765, was the first official meeting between the colonists. At this first meeting, they discussed the need to take a first step toward colonial unification against England. All the colonies got together and agreed to team up against the English crown should they attack.
The Stamp Act Congress was followed by the Committees of Correspondence, originally organized in Boston and other Massachusetts towns. The Committees of Correspondence eventually spread throughout the colonies, passing colonists information they needed about the British. This intelligence helped turn public opinion against the English.
And then the ball got rolling, and the colonists got together yet again at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, September 5th, 1774. 56 delegates attended, representing every colony but Georgia. At the time, the colonists didn't want to do anything radical, just discuss a few issues with the king.
So the Continental Congress put their demands together in a document called The Stupid List of Stupid Reasons That England is Stupid. After much deliberation and market research, the name of this document was changed to the Declaration of Rights and Resolves. The Declaration of Rights and Resolves called for certain colonial rights.
The people demand the rights of petition and assembly. The people demand the right to trial by peers. The people demand freedom from a standing army. The people demand the right to elect representatives who will levy taxes.
The English monarch, King George, read the declaration and pretty much said,
"Nuts to this."
So the colonists reconvened in May of 1775 at the Second Continental Congress.
At that point, it was pretty much a done deal, as fighting had broken out in the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord, with what Ralph Waldo Emerson called the shot heard round the world.
In spite of this, the colonists made one last-ditch effort at peace, drafting the Olive Branch Petition, though it wasn't actually printed on an olive branch or signed by anyone.
My petition?
Still, the colonists thought it was a pretty nice gesture, but when King George saw it, he pretty much said,
"Nuts to this."
And then he sent 20,000 troops over, just for fun. With all those troops sitting around, the colonists got pretty annoyed. Eventually, the American Revolution broke out because the king was unresponsive to the colonists' demands.
As the war raged on, the colonists got more assertive. They wanted their freedom from the crown and were willing to put up a fight.
The Declaration of Independence is one of the most important documents in our history. It currently makes its home at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The Declaration of Independence did just what its title states, declared the colonists' independence from England. It's not a very creative title, but it still served its purpose.
On July 9, 1776, the colonists presented the Declaration of Independence, which had been drafted mainly by Thomas Jefferson. The preamble to the Declaration contained many of John Locke's ideas and went a little something like this.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So basically, the Declaration of Independence said sayonara to the English crown and outlined the principles for a new government.
The preamble continued.
Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to abolish it.
After the preamble, the Declaration went on to list all the things England had done to anger the colonists, mostly violations of personal rights.
Once the Declaration of Independence was in the can, the colonists went to work on that other important document we mentioned, the Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation were in force from March 1st, 1781 to June 21st, 1788, when the Constitution went into effect. The Articles were written in 1777 during the early part of the American Revolution by John Dickinson and a committee of representatives from 13 colonies.
The Articles of Confederation was written in 1776 before the Revolutionary War and was ratified in 1781 after the Revolutionary War. Essentially, the Articles created a league of friendship among the states who, aside from banding together in the war against England, had remained mostly independent.
The Articles of Confederation was the colonists' first attempt at a unified national government. At the time, few colonists thought of themselves as Americans. They were fiercely loyal to their states and had some problems taking a national government seriously.
Pardon me, sir, but this is where the Continental Congress is meeting.
Yeah, that's a good one, Whig boy.
In a confederation, the states held most of the power, not the national government. And once the Revolutionary War was over, there wasn't much left to unify the states, and the government collapsed. With no power to tax and no way to regulate trade between the states, there wasn't much the government could do to assert its control on a national level. In fact, the national government was so wimpy that at one point it often forgot Congress was driven out of Philadelphia by its own unpaid army.
You may have wondered just why everyone tended to want such an oddly fashioned, yellow-bellied, limp-fish government. Well, think about it historically. The states were afraid to give too much control to one central government for fear that America would turn into another England. In the states' eyes, one central government with lots of power resulted in oppression.
So, the states made their own treaties with other nations. There was no national army, and the budding young country was facing organizational chaos.
That's when the then nearly powerless Congress stepped in and passed a resolution calling for a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. And believe it or not, it sounded like a good idea to a fair amount of the states.
Delegates representing the states met back in Philadelphia once again in May of 1787, with everyone but Rhode Island choosing to attend. They came up with two different blueprints for a new government, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan.
The Virginia Plan called for a strong national government that derived its power from the people, not from the states. The New Jersey Plan, on the other hand, called for a loose confederation of states that would share power with a national government. Eventually, the Virginia Plan triumphed.
One of the biggest hang-ups at the Constitutional Convention involved representation in Congress. The large states wanted more power because they represented a larger population of citizens. The small states wanted to make sure they didn't get steamrolled just because they were small. To solve this problem, the delegates came up with the Great Compromise.
The Great Compromise basically established Congress as we know it today. The deal was that each state, no matter what size, would be represented in two ways in Congress. In order to do this, a two-part Congress was formed. The Congress would have two parts called houses. You may know them as the Senate and the House of Representatives.
In the Senate, each state, no matter what its size, gets 2 representatives. This equal representation in the Senate made the small states happy. On the other hand, members of the House of Representatives would be determined by state population. This made the big states happy. The more people in a state, the greater the number of representatives in the House.
Unfortunately, great as it was, the Great Compromise led to a whole other can of worms. The states couldn't agree on how to determine their populations. Even though slaves were not allowed to vote, southern states wanted them to be counted because it would give them more representation in the House of Representatives. Eventually, the delegates decided on the 3/5 compromise, and a state's population was determined by counting slaves as 3/5 of a person.
That about wraps up our look at America in its pre-Constitution years. Let's take a quick look back at what we've covered.
After the French and Indian War, England placed certain acts on the colonists. The angered colonists wrote the Declaration of Rights and Resolves, and eventually, the Revolutionary War broke out. After the war, the Articles of Confederation were ratified. The Articles called for Confederate government, where states held most of the power. This form of government didn't quite work out, so in 1787 the Constitutional Convention was held. The delegates at the convention made a compromise which called for a two-part Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Well, that does it for our program. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? I'm Christiana Knight. Thanks for watching Standard Deviant School.